Hello learners, welcome to today's video. I am Dr. Mitali Bhagwati, Assistant Professor, Discipline of Philosophy, Krishnakanta Handikoy State Open University. So today we are going to discuss John Locke's Scientific Realism. The course name of this course is Fundamentals of Philosophy. The unit is Realism and this is the second part of this unit. This unit is basically divided into two parts, that is naive realism and scientific realism. In the first part of this unit, we have already discussed about naive realism and its characteristics. In this video, we will start with the general characteristics of realism, and after that we shall move on to understanding what is realism, its kinds, and what is scientific realism. So before going to scientific realism, let's start with what does realism mean? In the epistemology branch of philosophy, there is an important question about knowledge. That is, what is the nature of knowledge? For this question, there is two major views. First is that knowledge is dependent on the knowing mind, which is represented by the theory of idealism. Secondly, this question is answered by the theory which explains that knowledge is independent of the knowing mind. This view is represented by the theory of realism. Realism in philosophy is a complex and multifaceted concept that has evolved across different philosophical traditions. Let me provide a comprehensive overview of philosophical realism. At its core, philosophical realism is the view that reality exists independently of our perception, conceptualization, and understanding. It asserts that there are objective truths and entities that exist external to human minds regardless of whether we perceive or comprehend them. Naive realism or popular realism is the simplest form of realism. As one of the types of realism, the central theme of it is that the object of knowledge is independent of the knower's mind. The knower of the objects knows something directly with all its qualities. The nature of the known object is exactly similar to the way the knower knows it. There is nothing to intervene that functions as the mediator between the knower and the known object. The object of knowledge is exactly reflected before us as something is seen in front of a mirror. So Durant Durkheim is said to have used the term naive realism for the first time in his book Invitation of Philosophy, which was published in the year 1933. The main theme of naive realism is that the object of knowledge, along with its quality like color, taste, smell, extension, length, etc., has its existence independent of knowing mind. It is called naive realism because it is the common sense view about the external world in the most unphilosophical manner. Naive realism is therefore all about the idea of the external object which an ordinary man possesses. So now we have to understand in this video we are particularly dealing with the second part of this unit, that is scientific realism. Scientific realism was expounded by John Locke. It is proposed that the entities described by scientific theories actually exist. It argues that scientific theories provide true or approximately true description of both observable and unobservable aspect of the world. It believes that the success of scientific predictions validates the existence of theoretical entities. Scientific realism is founded by John Locke, as we have already mentioned, who is also considered as one of the founders of empiricism, arguing that all knowledge comes from experience. He famously proposed the concept of the mind as a tabula rasa or blank slate at birth, rejecting the notion of innate ideas. According to Locke, our minds are furnished with ideas through two types of experience. Firstly, sensation, that is the information about the external objects received through our senses, and second is reflection, our mind's awareness of its own operations. So learners, Scientific realism is a form of realism established by the British philosopher John Locke. The origin of scientific realism has come with a negative approach by criticizing the limitations of naive realism. As a kind of realism, scientific realism believes in the existence of external world independent of the knowing mind. Locke, in his analysis, tries to give a scientific account of the experience of the external world. Locke is an empiricist philosopher, as we have already mentioned. Locke, in his book An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, gives a detailed analysis of the nature of knowledge. In this context, Locke analyzes the nature of the external objects and its relation to the knower. Locke tries to explain the relationship between the knower and the known object scientifically. That is why Locke's version of realism is also known as scientific realism. So, according to this theory of Locke, we cannot know an object directly. We can have knowledge of an object only by the copy or the image or representation of the object. We can know an object by the qualities it possesses. This is why Locke's scientific realism is also called representationalism. But all the qualities of an object are not independent of the mind. Some qualities are the inherent properties of an object, whereas some are dependent on the mind or the consciousness of the knower. As Locke's theory is based on an analysis of qualities of the external objects, therefore, sometimes it is also called critical realism. So, in this video, let us try to understand the philosophy of John Locke. Locke's aim to determine the limits of human understanding. He believed that by examining our own mental powers, we could better understand what kind of knowledge we can acquire and what lies beyond our cognitive reach. Locke believed in objective moral truth discoverable through reason. He argued that God gave humans the capacity for reason to aid in the search for truth and to understand our moral duties, including the preservation of ourselves and others. John Locke's idea have had a lasting impact on Western philosophy, political theory, and the development of liberal democracy. His emphasis on individual rights, limited government, and religious tolerance helped shape the intellectual foundations of the Enlightenment and modern political thought. Philosophy deals with knowledge and reality, as we all know. In philosophy, various analyses of reality are found. Realism is a philosophical theory according to which objects of our knowledge are real. This view is also called objectivism. So, realism as a metaphysical theory is concerned with existence of objects or things. Epistemological analysis of realism is that objects are independent of knowing minds or the knower. According to realism, knower and object of knowledge are only externally related. The reality of an object is not affected by its relation with the knower. Therefore, the basic principle of realism is that the object and its qualities are independent of the knowing mind. A few characteristics of realism are existence of object is independent of knowledge, and the qualities of objects are inherent in the objects. So, knowledge does not affect an object. Locke, in his analysis, tried to give a scientific account of experiences of the external world. Locke was an empiricist philosopher, as we have already mentioned, and he described the nature of knowledge. And for him, as an empiricist, he believes that there is nothing in the intellect that was not previously present in the senses. Thus, Locke explains knowledge in terms of experience. Now, learners, let's try to understand the shift characteristics of scientific realism, which are like objects are independent of knowledge. As a form of realism, scientific realism believes that objects exist independently of the knowledge of the object, knowledge of them. And they exist by themselves. Objects are not known directly. One can know an object by its qualities. In explaining this, Locke introduced the idea of the primary quality and the secondary qualities, and Locke describes knowledge as an indirect process. So, according to Locke, there is a distinction between the primary and the secondary qualities of objects. And John Locke distinguishes between primary and secondary qualities of objects, and this says that the primary qualities are immune to any influence of knowledge because they belong to the object itself. A few examples of primary qualities are like shape, the size of things, length, solidity, number, and mobility, etc. These are primary qualities because they belong to the objects. On the other hand, the qualities those do not exist in the objects are called secondary qualities. For example, color, taste, smell, heat, etc. are secondary qualities and they vary to different person or same person at different time. So the primary qualities of the objects do not depend on the knower. As the primary qualities belong to the object, therefore knowledge cannot influence the primary qualities. The primary qualities are objective and general. Mind does not conjure up the primary ideas because they are images of primary qualities. But secondary ideas are copies of secondary qualities and they are influenced by knowledge. Primary ideas originating in objects are public. For primary ideas, objects are public. As the fundamental criterion of realism, objects do not depend on the knowledge for their existence. By differentiating between primary and secondary qualities, scientific realism holds that objects, primary qualities, and the primary objects are public or objective. They do not differ from person to person. In this way, by showing the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, Locke tried to give away a scientific interpretation of the nature of external world. Knowledge is obtained as a representation of the objects of the external world. Hence, Locke's view of knowledge is also called representationalism. In this point of today's video, let's also try to understand the difference between naive realism and scientific realism. Naive and scientific realism are two types of realism which put forward their own versions of realism. Both type of realism possesses the realistic attitude. But naive and scientific realism differs in certain points. According to naive realism, objects exist independently of knowledge of it. Scientific realism also accepts that objects are independent of knowledge. But it also accepts that metaphysical speculation depends upon the mind. Again, according to naive realism, qualities of object exist in it. But in scientific realism, the secondary qualities of the objects are imposed by the mind in the objects. According to naive realism, knowledge does not influence the objects. But according to scientific realism, ideas can also be influenced the objects in some cases. And in naive realism, object is what appears to be. But in scientific realism, there is a difference between the actual objects of its ideas, which is only a image of the real object. So according to naive realism, knowledge is direct, but in scientific realism, knowledge is indirect. And in naive realism, we find that objects are known directly, but in scientific realism, knowledge of an object is in its complex form through the help of simple ideas. Again, naive realism holds that objects are public or objective, but scientific realism states that primary ideas are objective, but in case of secondary ideas, objects are not so public or objective because they differ from person to person, or sometimes it also differs for the same person in different time. So learners, in this point of the video, we should now try to evaluate ourselves with certain questions such as what is realism? What are the measure two types of realism? What is naive realism? How the naive realistic thinkers describe the status of object? Who for the first time coined the term naive realism? And naive realism is also known as representationism. Is it true or is it false? Now again, we can also have the questions like who establishes scientific realism? How does scientific realism describe the status of the objects? For the scientific realism, objects are directly known. Is it true or false? What is the primary quality according to Locke? What are the secondary qualities according to Locke? Are primary qualities of an object subjective or objective as described by Locke? Again, we can ask the question, Are subjective qualities of an object subjective or objective as described by Locke? If we try to sum up the whole theme of scientific realism, we have to understand that from like very general view, philosophy deals with knowledge and reality. Realism is a philosophical theory according to which objects of our knowledge are real. Realism as a metaphysical theory is concerned with existence of objects or things, and realism from the epistemological perspective, epistemological analysis of realism is that objects are independent of knowing mind or the knower. And the two major forms of realism are that we have studied today is naive realism and scientific realism. And the scientific realism was established by John Locke. And in his book, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Locke described the nature of knowledge according to which knowledge proper is certain, instructive, and real. As a form of realism, scientific realism believes that objects exist independently of the knowledge of them and they exist by themselves. And according to Locke, one can know an object by its qualities. Locke introduced the idea of primary and secondary qualities. Locke described knowledge as an indirect process. According to scientific realism, primary qualities are objective and secondary qualities are subjective. Scientific realism of Locke is also known as representationalism. Scientific realism holds that knowledge of an object is in its complex form through the help of simple ideas. So, John Locke's scientific realism is a sophisticated philosophical framework that attempts to reconcile empiricism with the emerging scientific worldview of the 17th century. This comprehensive theory encompasses the epistemology, metaphysics, and philosophy of science, offering a overall a general account of human knowledge and its relationship to the external world. John's scientific realism is grounded in his empiricist epistemology, which posits that all knowledge ultimately derives from the sensory experience. He famously argues against innate ideas, asserting that the human mind begins as a blank slate, which is known as tabula rasa. This empiricist foundation leads Locke to develop a theory of ideas that serve as the cornerstone of his scientific realism. For Locke, ideas are the fundamental units of mental content and the building blocks of knowledge. He defines an idea boldly as whatsoever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. Ideas can be simple or complex. Simple ideas are the basic, unanalyzable element of experience, such as the sensation of a particular color or the feeling of heat. Complex ideas are formed by combining, comparing, or abstracting from simple ideas. Locke's theory of ideas is crucial to his scientific realism because it provides a framework for understanding how the mind represents and processes information about the external world. A key aspect of Locke's scientific realism in his commitment to representative realism, also known as indirect realism. This view holds that we do not perceive external object directly, but rather through the mediation of ideas. As Locke put in, what we perceive are not the objects, but an idea of the object in the real world. This representational theory of perception has important implication for Locke's scientific realism. And this theory acknowledges the reality of an external world independent of human mind. It recognizes the potential for the differences between our ideas and the objects they represent. It provides a framework for understanding how scientific knowledge can be both empirically grounded and favorable. And we have to understand that the distinction between primary and secondary qualities that Locke talk about is also very important to understand scientific realism. One of the most influential aspects of John Locke's scientific realism is his distinction of the primary and secondary qualities. This distinction is crucial for understanding the relationship of between our perceptions and the external world. And what are the primary qualities? The primary qualities are those that Locke believes exist in the object themselves, regardless of whether they are perceived. And these are, for example, extension, that is the size and shape of a certain thing, the solidity, and the motion or rest, the number. So Locke argues that our ideas are primary qualities, resemble the qualities as they exist in the object themselves. This resemblance theory is a key component of his scientific realism, as it provides a basis for claiming, uh, claiming that our scientific understanding can accurately represent real feature of the world. And secondary qualities, in contrast, are powers that objects have to produce certain sensation in observers. And this includes that the color or the taste. So Locke contains the secondary quality do not exist in the object themselves in the same way that the primary qualities do. Instead, they are the result of the interaction between an object's primary quality and our sensory uh, experience. This distinction has significant implication for scientific realism. For firstly, it suggests that some aspect of our experience, those related to primary qualities, of course, more directly represent the external world than others. Again, it provides a basis for explaining why some properties of objects seems to vary depending on the observer or the condition of observation. Thirdly, it aligns with the emerging mechanistic worldview of 17th century science, which sought to explain phenomena in terms of the motion and interaction of particles. Now, let's come to the limits of human understanding. While Locke is committed to scientific realism, he is also keenly aware of the limitations of human knowledge. This awareness leads him to adopt a cautious and critical approach to scientific claims. Locke's empiricism provided a philosophical foundation for the emerging experimental science of the 17th century. His emphasis on the observation and experience as the source of knowledge aligned well with the methodological innovations of British scientists like Robert Boyle and also scientists like Isaac Newton. So Locke's ideas had a significant impact on later philosophers, particularly in the British empiricist tradition. Thinkers like Berkeley, Hume built on Locke's theories of ideas even as they challenged aspect of his realism. So in conclusion, we can say that John Locke's scientific realism represents a sophisticated attempt to reconcile empiricism with the emerging scientific worldview of the 17th century by grounding knowledge in sensory experience while acknowledging the reality of an external world. Locke provided a framework for understanding scientific knowledge that was both empirically grounded and realistically oriented. His distinction between primary and secondary qualities, his theory of representative realism, and his recognition of the limits of human understanding all contributed to a very influential philosophy of science. While aspects of Locke's theory have been challenged, his emphasis on empirical observation, questions reasoning, and the probabilistic nature of scientific knowledge continues to resonate with modern scientific practice. Ultimately, Locke's scientific realism explains, and it is shown as a careful balance between empirical rigor and metaphysical modesty, a balance that remains relevant to contemporary discussion in philosophy of science and epistemology. So, learners, this was the second part of Unit 7, that is realism. And in today's video, we have tried to understand what is scientific realism, how it is different from naive realism, and how John Locke has explained it critically. So thank you very much for staying with me till the end of this video. See you all in the next video.